Oh, hello there, and welcome to this week's Zenography vlog, whatever that means. And this week we'll be looking at this little piece of Soviet photography kit. This is the Zorki 4, and it's a wonderful old thing. Firstly, it's brilliant because it's a memento of the Soviet Union, and you know, whatever you think of the Soviet Union, whether it was a good or a bad thing, it's not there anymore. It's gone. It was a unique social experiment, and this is one of the things that came out of it. So the Zorki 4, what can we say? Well, it's a rangefinder camera. Much like the Leicas that we've talked about so far. The history of the Zorki is quite interesting. It was, as you might know, it's very closely based on the Leica design. In fact, the first Zorkis were copies of the Leica 2. They were called the Zorki 1, and they were made, I don't know, from something like the early 50s right up until I think the late 50s, maybe early 60s sometime, somewhere around that time. And there was another Russian company that made them similar copies of the Leica 2. They were the Feds. So the Fed company and the Zorki company made copies of the Leica 2, and that's how the Zorki camera came into being, and that's why it's such a close relative of the Leica rangefinder. This is a Soviet development of the Leica concept, and in fact, in some ways, it's you know, it's got unique features of its own that make it quite a worthwhile piece of kit. It's very heavy. It's really heavy. And it's quite nicely finished. There's the top plate there. You can see that. See, it's quite nicely finished. The edges are all nicely finished. The controls are, you know, a little bit rough and ready, a little bit more rough and ready than the Leica, but they're still pretty nice. It's a bit larger, very slightly larger than the early Leica cameras, and then a bit larger than the Zorki 1. One of the main features that this has, where it really scores over the early Leicas, is this window here. This is a combined rangefinder and viewfinder window. So if you look through that window, you will see the rangefinder within the viewfinder. You'll see the little rangefinder patch within the viewfinder. And that's something that the early Leicas didn't have. If you remember the Leica 2 and the 3 that we've looked at, they had two separate windows. There was a window here and a window here. One for the rangefinder, one for composing. This has the rangefinder built into the viewfinder. And that's a really good development, because it means you don't have to swap look through two different windows. It's all mechanical. There's absolutely no electronics on it. It works by springs and levers and gears. There is absolutely no automatic exposure or focusing on it. The focusing is by rangefinder. The exposure is simply is set very simply. There's an aperture ring on the front of the lens here, and there's a shutter speed dial on the top of the camera there. Just have a look at that top plate there and you'll see what I mean. There's the shutter speed dial, that runs from 1 second, and there's a B setting as well, right through to 1,000th of a second, so there's a fair range of speeds. There's the shutter release there, and here this is the wind on. Yeah, so it's very similar to the Leica. There's a shoe here, an accessory shoe, and there's also a diopter adjuster for if you wear glasses. That you can move that and adjust the focus of the rangefinder and the viewfinder. So very simple. Wind it on, set the shutter speed, fire the shutter. This is a very early Zorki 4. The Zorki 4s were made, I think, from the late 50s, and if we include the 4K, which had a lever wind here instead of the you know, the rotary knob that you turn, they were made right up until the mid-80s, I believe, by Krasnogorsk Mechaniski Zavod, Krasnogorsk Mechanical Works. This is an early one, and in my opinion it's not finished quite as nice as the later ones were. The later ones had a nylon cloth around the body here. This, I think, I'm pretty sure this is just metal, you know, or it may be maybe a plastic finish that's been put on there, but it's not that nice a finish, to be honest. It's a little bit shiny, and it looks a bit tacky to me. Maybe that was you know, quite the thing in 50s Soviet Russia, but to me it's not finished quite as nicely as the later Zorkis were. But nevertheless, it's a nice old camera, and in fact this is a good one. The early Zorkis are good because the shutter speeds are engraved around this dial here. They're actually engraved rather than being printed on, which the later ones were, and that can wear off. So get an engraved one, get an early one if you can, which has the engraved markings around here. Now, speaking of these markings, I gotta say, I find them very small. When I first started, I learned with a Russian rangefinder, not a Zorki, a Fed actually. I learned photography with a Russian rangefinder when I was about 14, which is going back a bit now. And I could see quite a bit better in those days. I do find now that I can't really see terribly clearly these numbers because they are very small. But you know, that's just me. So it's a case of put your glasses on to set the shutter speed. So turn the wind on knob. The wind on is a bit tricky because there's no space for your thumb there, so you've got to do it like that. Yeah. Then you set your shutter speed in the same way that you set the Leica shutter speed. You just lift up this little thing here, turn it, and drop it down at the right speed. Remember, on a camera with this mechanism, whether it's a Leica or a Zorki or a Fed, never set that speed before you've wound on the film. Always wind on the film first and then set the speed. And that's on, what's that on now? That's on 1/250th now. And there it goes. It's got slow speeds, so we'll wind it around to the slow speeds. Put it on 1 second. That's a nice, you can hear the old mechanical clockwork mechanism going there. That's a nice old mechanical sound. It's got a B setting. The B is next to the 1, but you can't turn this thing between 1 and B. You have to turn it the opposite way. Yeah, so never turn it between 1 and B. We'll break it. So B is the usual thing. Push it down to open the shutter. Oh, that didn't work. That was 1/30th, my apologies. Let's actually turn it to B. Yeah, so push it down, the shutter opens, and take your finger off and the shutter closes. Nice and easy, nice simple design. One thing to remember with these cameras is never leave it set to a slow speed or B. So always make sure when you're done shooting, you're set to a higher speed. Yeah, and never leave it in tension. Always make sure the shutter's fired before you put it away. There is on this camera an Industar 50 lens, which seriously must be the ugliest lens in the world. It is absolutely awful looking, but it's a very nice lens. It's actually really sharp. It runs from f3.5 to f16, so it's not a particularly fast lens. And it's really not a pretty lens, but it is a pretty sharp lens. So let's just show you the inner workings now. The usual thing, we've got the Leica thread mount. Take that off. In there we can see the Leica type shutter, the curtains, and the rangefinder cam there, which, unlike a Leica, is a wedge shape rather than a circle wheel. And so that's a wedge shape. All the Russian cameras had a wedge there instead of a wheel. The back comes off this camera completely. Yeah, so we'll just open up the back now. Turn that. And turn that. Off it comes. Oops. Drop the spool. Yeah. So be very careful not to touch the shutter there, but you can see there the shutter. Don't touch it, of course, because it's rubberized cloth and it's actually really delicate. But I'll show you the camera in operation now. If we wind it on, you should see, as I fire the shutter, you should see a little glimpse of light through there. Yeah, that was very quick. Let's set it to a slower speed. So we'll set it to 1 second. And there we go. Yeah, so that opens and closes nicely, just like it was meant to. And one thing you can say about these cameras, they're not as nicely finished as the Leica, but my goodness, they've stood the test of time. You know, this is from 1964. You can tell that because the first letters of the serial number on the back there are 64. And on a Zorki, that will always tell you the year of manufacture, the first two numbers of the serial number. So just watch that shutter go across again. You can see the two curtains going across there as I wind it. Yeah, it's a bit stiff. It's not as buttery, silky smooth as the Leica shutter, but it's pretty good. It's stood the test of time. And it's a lovely old thing. It still works nicely. So to put it back, what we do is we put the spool in there, and then here's the back. You can see the back there. It's got the pressure plate on the back, which you can see there. And so we just lay that. That wasn't in the script. We just lay that on there, like that. Yeah. Push it down because the pressure plate will push up. And then make sure it just slides into the slot there. And then turn the locking clips, one there and one there. Push them down, and that's that done. lens back on. So, is this as good as a Leica? Well, in practice, yes it is. It's not as nice. It's not as nicely finished. But once you've said that, in many ways it's a better camera. It's got the one window eyepiece. It's got a self-timer, which is on the front here. So you wind on your film, turn this around, again it's all mechanical, and press the button to start it. This is the old school way to do selfies, I think. And so you hear the shutter fire there. So, for all practical purposes, this is, this is much the same as using an old Leica, and it's actually a very groovy looking camera. I think it looks really cool. I do like this shape here. It's got this cutout here, and then the raised platform level along here, and then the other cutout here. I think it's a really nice piece of design, actually. I think it's really, really quirky looking old camera. A very cool looking old camera as well. I've always liked the design of this camera. If you compare it to the Fed cameras, the Fed 4, the Fed 3, well, I've got to say they are very, very ugly cameras. They're perfectly good, they do the job, and in fact that's the camera I learned photography on, and it's another Leica clone, but they're very ugly. This one is actually quite a good looking camera. This one and the later Zorki 4K that followed it are pretty good looking camera. It's fairly small. Fits on the palm of your hand there. A little bit of room to spare. And it's a very nice old piece of kit to go out and do rangefinder film photography with. And it does have one massive advantage over the Leica cameras, and that is cost. These are very, very, very cheap cameras. They really are. They're well made, they're sturdy, they're retro, they're old school, and they've got a little bit of cool about them. And a good one will cost you no more than 40 quid from eBay or wherever else. If somebody is asking more than 40 quid for one of these, don't pay it, because they're not worth any more than that. You can find them from as cheap as, I've found them for as cheap as 15 quid, in perfectly good working order. Don't forget, when you're buying one, if you buy one, test the shutter speeds out, check the rangefinder, make sure you can see clearly the double split image, make sure all the speeds work, and if it all checks out, then there's very little that can really go wrong, because there isn't much to these cameras. To wind on the film after you've finished shooting, you push down this collar here, which surrounds the shutter release button, so it's a bit tricky. You've got to push it down like that until it stays down, and that changes a gear in there somewhere in the works there, which means that once you pull this thing up here, that usually sits down there, but you pull this up here, that's the rewind key, and you just turn it clockwise until you feel tension, and it'll stop, and then that means that the film is fully wound. Then turn it past the tension, it'll come out of the spool, and wind it back into the canister, and push it down when you're done. Lift up the little collar again, turn it to lift it, and wind on. Couple of frames, just to make sure all the mechanical parts are sitting back where they should be within the body of the camera. So there we are, the Zorki 4. It stood the test of time. It's a groovy old thing, and it's well worth having a go with one of these if you want to try film photography, and if you want to try rangefinder photography. This is a really good place to start. And like all old cameras, if you buy one, use it. Maybe you keep it, you know, because they're a nice old antique to have around. But if you find, oh well, I don't want to keep hold of it, you know, why should I leave it around? Pass it on to someone else. You'll easily be able to sell it for at least as much as you bought it for, and you might even make a couple of bob on it. So that can't be a bad thing. Okay, so until next time, for further Zenography, whatever that should turn out to be, this is me signing off with the Zorki 4.